Thank you, Tadeusz. Good evening, good afternoon for some of you, and a very warm welcome from a very warm Jerusalem. My name is Karen Sethill. I'm from the National Library of Israel, and it is a great pleasure to open the 5th event in our series, marking this special Platinum Jubilee year in Her Majesty's Kingdom, celebrating the rich history of Anglo Jewry. And we're especially happy to see some familiar faces and names from our previous events. For this series, we've been focusing on Anglo Jewry through different formats of material culture. From our opening historical overview, we've looked at Yiddish writing and song, oral histories from the Sephardi community, the work of Jewish artists, and this evening, we're turning to explore English literature, which is perhaps an obvious subject for a library, but from a somewhat parochial perspective, looking at how leading British writers imagined and related to the concept of a Jewish state. We're delighted to have Daniel Taub as our speaker this evening. He will be known to many of you as an Israeli diplomat and international lawyer, notably serving as the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom from 2011 to 2015, and more recently as director of strategy and planning of the Yad Hanadiv Rothschild Foundation from 2015 to 2021, in which role he has become a true friend and advocate for the National Library of Israel. Daniel has held a wide variety of legal and diplomatic posts and has represented Israel in many international negotiations. He asked me to make sure, though, that I mentioned in the spirit of our topic tonight that his first degree from University College, Oxford, was in English literature, which he then followed with international law from University College London and public administration from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Daniel will speak for about 50 minutes, and then he'll be very happy to take your questions, so please write these in the chat and Q&A. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen. What a pleasure to be part of this wonderful British Royal Platinum series, and altogether what a pleasure to partner with the library. The National Library, as I've discovered, is this extraordinary, inexhaustible treasure house. And alongside all of our expectations for the spectacular new building we're hoping to see early next year, in the last 2 years, particularly during Corona and beyond, we've seen such exciting online offerings. So many thanks to you, Karen, to Tadeusz, to the whole of the team for sharing so much of the library with such a wide audience. And as you mentioned, what I'd like to look at this evening is the question of how Israel, the idea of the State of Israel, and the reality of the State of Israel has been portrayed in English literature. And although it's true, as you mentioned, many years ago, I did study English literature as my first degree, my interest in the subject actually didn't date back to then. It came much later. It really came one evening when I was reading a bedtime story to one of my children. And we were reading a series called the Alex Ryder series, which some of you with teenagers may know. The Alex Ryder series is a series about a young James Bond character with lots of gadgets who fights arch villains from all around the world. And so I'm sitting next to my kid, reading him this story, and he's fighting these various arch villains. This is a book called Scorpio, which is the organization of arch villains. And I come across a description of one of them. And his name is Levi Kroll. And he's described as follows. It was typical of Levi Kroll to be blunt and to the point. He had joined Scorpio from the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, and he still thought of himself as a soldier. For 20 years, he had slept with a 9mm pistol under his pillow. Then one night, it had gone off. An eye patch hid the empty socket where his left eye had once been. So I'm sitting there in my child's bedroom, trying to ponder the question how in just a few decades, we could have gone from Moshe Dayan to Levi Kroll, from the one-eyed hero to the one-eyed villain. And as I was thinking about that, I thought that the story of the portrayal of Israel in literature is a much bigger story. And this evening, what I'd like to do, and obviously I have to be selective because there is so much, just to identify some personal landmarks to try and chart that larger story of Israel in the British literary imagination. And so I'd like to start really with one of the happiest places, and it's in the 19th century. Here it's actually in the 1870s, where there was a spate, almost a feast of what was called proto-Zionist literature. People were captivated by the idea of the return of Jews to their historic homeland. And, you know, some of those authors were Jewish. Benjamin Disraeli was one of them, but the most famous, of course, was George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans, with her final book, her last novel, called Daniel Deronda. And Daniel Deronda is really one of the few books in English literature that really could have been written with a grant from the World Zionist Organization. The Daniel Deronda, the main character, is an assimilated Jew, and he is torn between two heroines, the beautiful Gwendolyn Harleth and the exotic Jewess Mira Lapidot. And Mira comes from a Zionist family. And in fact, her brother Mordechai is one of the most passionate voices for the Zionist movement. So here, just to give you a flavor, is Mira's brother Mordechai explaining the need of a Jewish state to Daniel Deronda. He says, I say that the effect of our separateness will not be completed and have its highest transformation unless our race takes on again the character of a nationality. Then shall we have an organic center, a heart and a brain to watch and guide and execute. The outraged Jew shall have a defense in the court of nations as the outraged Englishman or American, and the world will gain as Israel gains, for there will be a community in the van of the East which carries the culture and the sympathies of every great nation in its bosom. A wonderful piece of Zionist literature, halavai, one might say, if only when one reads that description. So it's a marvelous piece of Zionist literature. Unfortunately, it is not generally regarded as a great piece of English literature. It's not regarded as one of George Eliot's greatest novels. Restorationism, the idea of the Jews being returned to their historic homeland. But there is I think, a really surprising reference to the reality of the Yishuv, and that comes in probably one of the most famous, most influential novels of the 20th century, and that is Ulysses by the Irish writer James Joyce. And the main character in Ulysses, anyone who's read it will know it's a challenging novel, a ground path-breaking novel, but challenging. It's written as a sort of complex stream of conscious, and it takes place in the mind of a single character, Leopold Bloom, who is Jewish, or at least half Jewish. His father is Jewish. And actually, the subject of Israel, the possibility of the state of Israel, occurs in the book on a number of occasions. Most significantly, at the beginning of the book, with, I think, a certain amount of irony, Leopold Bloom goes off to buy a piece of pork for his wife. And the pork is wrapped up, not in newspaper, but in a flyer, which is actually a flyer from a Zionist organization advertising the purchase of land in Palestine. And we see Leopold Bloom reading this flyer. Let's just... So he walked back along Dorset Street in Dublin, reading gravely, Agudat Nata'im, Planters Company, to purchase vast sandy tracts from the Turkish government and to plant with eucalyptus trees, excellent for shade, fuel, and construction. Orange groves and immense melon fields north of Jaffa. Every year you get a sending of the crop. Your name entered for life as owner in the Book of the Union. You can pay 10 down and the balance in yearly installments. Bleibtreustrasse, 34, Berlin. And of course, Bleibtreustrasse, Stay True Street. The idea of the Jews remaining faithful to their historic land. And that actually may be the first description, at least the first that I've come across in English literature, not of a fantasized ideal of Israel, but a description of something that relates to the actual Yishuv. Bloom is not persuaded. He decides that it isn't a realistic possibility. Symbolically, as he's reading it, a cloud comes over and covers the sun. And he thinks about it, and this is what Israel means to him at the time. He says, a barren land, bare waste, volcanic lake, the Dead Sea, no fish, weedless, sunk deep in the earth. A dead sea and a dead land, grey and old. Old now, it bore the oldest, the first race, the oldest people, wandered far away over all the earth, captivity to captivity, multiplying, dying, being born everywhere. It lay there now it could bear no more. And even though the idea of Israel, the theme surfaces again in the course of the novel, later in a very odd scene, there's a sort of poetry slam between Leopold Bloom and his Irish friend Stephen Daedalus, and stuck to come up with a poem. Leopold Bloom comes out with Kol od belevav pnima nefesh Yehudi homia. But at the end of the book, he actually uses that flyer, he puts it on fire to light some incense, and it burns to ashes. And I think that theme of this barren land that is incapable of giving birth anymore is the predominant sense of the book. And I think it was a very understandable assessment at the time, the impossibility, writing in the 1920s, that this distant desert land would actually give birth again. And I think that sense, in part, is what gave such energy to the potency of a symbol of the early state of Israel, which is the kibbutz, which became a symbol of this impossible regeneration. But before I talk a little bit about the kibbutz, I do want to mention another curiosity that I found in the archives of the National Library with the help of the wonderful curators. And this is another Irish writer who had very strong feelings about Israel, not so much about the reality about Israel as about the politics of it. And that was George Bernard Shaw, who was fiercely opposed to the Balfour Declaration, so much so that he actually wrote a short play about the Balfour Declaration. It was never performed, but it was published in the socialist paper, The New Leader. And it was called Arthur and the Acetone. Arthur being Arthur Balfour, of course, who wrote the Balfour Declaration as Foreign Secretary, and the acetone being a reference to Chaim Weizmann. And Chaim Weizmann, of course, was a chemist at the University of Manchester. And when in the First World War, Britain was seriously disadvantaged because it couldn't produce enough acetone to make explosives for the war effort, it was his chemical process actually for distilling acetone from chestnuts that actually saved the British war effort, helped the British war effort, endeared him to David Lloyd George, who was the Minister of Munitions at the time. And according to George Bernard Shaw's telling of it, it was that basically paved the way for the Balfour Declaration. So in this short satirical play, we have Arthur Balfour complaining to his assistant that it has become prohibitively expensive to kill Germans. And he asks them, isn't there a cheaper way to make acetone? And his assistant says to him, they're doing their best, but nothing has come of it so far. There is a chemist in Manchester who has a microbe that makes acetone for next to nothing. Arthur Balfour says, send him here instantly. Why hasn't he been sent here before? The assistant says, impossible, sir, unfortunately. Balfour says, nothing is impossible when we are at war. Why is it impossible? And the assistant explains, he is a Jew, sir. Balfour, is his microbe a Jew? Assistant, I suppose not, sir. So they summon Weizmann, and Weizmann offers him an exorbitant sum of money. Weizmann says, I do not ask for money. And Balfour hints at the anti-Semitism at the time. He goes, there must be some misunderstanding. I was informed that you are a Jew. And Balfour carries on trying to bribe Weizmann to give up his microbe, including with peerages and so on and so forth. And finally, Weizmann reveals the only thing that would make him part with his microbe, and that is Jerusalem. And Balfour agrees. And at that point in the play, George Bernard Shaw himself makes an appearance on the stage, reading the Balfour Declaration and saying, "Another Ulster, as if one were not enough." So that was George Bernard Shaw's sort of political campaign, political statement against the Balfour Declaration. So I think it's a curiosity, but I think it's also a detour. I don't think it reflected very widespread feeling. And I think what we see reflected in English literature is a tremendous sense of excitement around both the establishment of the State of Israel, but more particularly following the Six-Day War. And as I mentioned earlier, it found expression in the idea of the kibbutz, which was, as I said, this remarkably potent experience. You know, in the 1970s, there were tens of thousands of young British people who came to volunteer on the kibbutz. The number that I have is some 94,000 young British people volunteered on the kibbutz throughout the 1970s. And some of them went on to positions of influence. So, you know, Carol Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher's daughter, Boris Johnson famously was one of the volunteers on kibbutz. Helen Mirren was a volunteer on kibbutz. So all of those people who are complaining that she's playing Golda Meir because she isn't Jewish, she can at least claim that she washed up the dishes in a kibbutz kitchen or something of the sort. But all of these visitors gave rise to what we might call a mini genre, and that is the kibbutz novel. And here is there is an absolute fascination with the sort of the disconnect between the Jews that they're aware of and these new Jews, these Jews with muscles and guns and so on. I remember as a youngster, once riding a bus in Israel, and there were two British public school boys on the bus who obviously didn't think anybody could understand English. And one of them was saying to the other, "Isn't it strange that Israelis are so dark when Jews are generally so pale?" And this was the disconnect that they just couldn't make sense of. And this, in a sense, is something that's reflected in the kibbutz literature. So there's a lot of it. I chose as one example. Here's a book called Kibbutz Virgin, and sexuality and hormones are a fair part of this genre as well. Jonathan Nichols was a volunteer from Sheffield, I think, who volunteered on Kibbutz Daphne. And he was sort of dazzled by the machoism of Israeli society. Here's one part. He goes, "Then there were the guns. There were guns everywhere, male and female soldiers, most of them young, slim and good looking in plain green uniforms. Some in pale blue uniforms were each carrying Uzi submachine guns or M16 rifles." And later in the book, he describes them as being the modern day Roman army, irresistible and all powerful. And it wasn't just, it wasn't just non-Jews, there were Jewish volunteers as well. There was a different volunteer, Jewish volunteer, Jonathan Wilson, wrote a very funny short novella about his time on kibbutz, the way that he described the relationships between the volunteers and the Israelis. He said it was quite clear that the male kibbutzniks were allowed to seduce the female volunteers, while we male volunteers were like young tribesmen who hadn't passed their initiation rites. We lived together in huts, and all the Israeli women were off limits. In any case, none of us stood a chance. We were a bunch of wimpy Westerners up against the heroes of the Six-Day War. Forget it. But I think the fascination with kibbutz wasn't just with machoism and with power and the new Israeli. I think it was also the appeal of a certain kind of earthy, simple idealism, life pared down to its bared limits. Here, for example, is Jonathan Nichols, the Sheffield volunteer again. He writes, "Amid the harsh, prosaic reality of daily kibbutz life, personalities and attitudes were more important than the size of your house, the type of car you drive, how many figures you had in the bank, or your family background. All these were irrelevant. We were all stripped bare and exposed for who we really were." And this idea of kibbutz being a place where you are stripped bare, that reveals who you truly are, was actually the subject of a play by a British playwright, later made into a film called Not Quite Jerusalem, which by Paul Kember, and it describes 4 British volunteers who come to work on an Israeli kibbutz. And the main thrust of the story is Mike, the hero, a medical student who falls in love with an Israeli kibbutznik, and spoiler alert, actually decides to stay in Israel. But there are 2 other characters, Pete and Dave, who are the sort of comic duo, and they themselves try to make sense of this disconnect that we were describing before between the modern Israeli Adonis and the traditional Jew that they are familiar with. So here is their take on the history of Zionism. One of them says the following: "We gave them this land, you know. Balfour. I was reading up on it. It's in that booklet they gave us. Must say you've got to hand it to them." Who? The Jews. You've got to admire them. I mean, only the Jews could come up with an idea like volunteering. Just think, they get free labor, that's clever. They get people to travel thousands of miles to give their free labor. Now that's brilliant. Not only that, but they even get them to pay their own effing airfare. Now that's what I call genius. And now he pretends to be an old style musical Jew. Now, Mr. Balfour's been kind enough to give us this strip of land. It's going to be sand, sand, and more sand. Not much, but it's a start. Now, I've been looking at the figures, and to get this place off the ground is going to take a great deal of work, but we're only a small deal of a people. What we need is labor. What we've got is sand. So I've been in the library all morning trying to figure out how you create labor out of nothing. And I've come up with the following: surplus energy. That's the key. Now, what group has surplus energy? You've got it. The young, the idealistic, the stupid. Now I've been looking at the word volunteer. If only we can find some reason to convince them that it's worth paying their own passage, they will give it shape, and it will be cheaper. Now I've been looking at the word sex, but with who? Oh, I've got it. With each other. That's perfect. So that is their somewhat cynical way of marrying the traditional conniving Jew with the idealism of the kibbutz. One of the things that's clear is that both, in different ways, but both for British volunteers and for Jews as well, I think the kibbutz was a kind of rebellion. It was a rebellion against the materialism of their society. It was a rebellion against their parents' generation. And we felt this with Jewish writers, including those that didn't even come to visit Israel. And one of the writers who writes about this really quite wonderfully is Linda Grant, a marvelous British novelist who's written a number of novels located in Israel, placed in Israel, but she also wrote a book called The People on the Street, which charts her own developing relationship with Israel. And early on in that relationship, she starts with her disaffection, her complex rebellion, not just against Israel, but against her parents. And it actually starts at a Zionist ball in Liverpool. And this is how she describes it. I started by refusing to come out at the blue and white ball at the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool, where Jewish girls in white dresses with blue sashes across their budding chests were presented against the backdrop of the Israeli flag to the Lord Mayor, who happened to be Jewish, and the orchestra played Hatikva. I can't say I rejected this event out of ideological conviction, but more a gut feeling that there were better things to do than be a Jewish debutante. And then she describes the difference in her attitudes to Israel to that of her parents. For her parents, she says, Israel for them was a flag, a national anthem, pride. Above all, I think pride, the antidote to humiliation. And when I discovered anti-Zionism, I knew that at long last I had a sharpened weapon in the endless war I was fighting against my father, his authority, his physical size. My anti-Zionism, she writes, was a form of cruelty and abuse which had nothing to do with any Palestinians I had ever met. It was sound and fury. My phony empathy with the Palestinians was a failure of empathy for my parents. Probably the most biting expression of this kind of generational rebellion comes in a bitingly satirical book called The Glittering Prizes by Frederick Raphael. It was also made into a TV series, and it charts the lives of a group of Cambridge graduates through and after they leave Cambridge University. And one of them, who I think it's fair to say Frederick Raphael is modeling on himself, is Adam Morris, who is very Jewish, very conflicted, very brilliant. He becomes a TV writer. He's full of success and doubts. And one chapter describes him speaking to the Hampstead Jewish Historical Society, where he obviously feels the need to make his voice felt in rebelling against the views of the older Jewish generation. And he really tries to shock them. Arabs, Adam said, it would be marvelous if they'd all just disappear. Well, wouldn't it? Imagine we wake up tomorrow morning, we have a nice cup of tea, and what do you know? Over to the newsroom. They've all disappeared, wiped off the face of the earth, all 100 million of them, gone. No blood, no mess, nothing but empty camels, full oil wells, and a very faint odor of the angel of the Lord with Ealing in his wings. Adam might have been addressing the nation, so careful with the consonants was his delivery. He now paused and considered his actual audience. There were not more than a dozen of them in a small upstairs room in Belsize Park. It was a meeting of the Hampstead Jewish Historical Society. And the old-time Jews, many of them presumably survivors, tried to argue back at him, but his rebellion knows no bounds. One of them says, Mr. Morris, my name is Mrs. Hirsch, may I say something? Israel was bought and paid for with the blood of 6 million martyrs. Maybe, Adam said, that wasn't what the Arabs wanted for it. And so on, until finally the head of the Historical Society stands up and announces, I'd like to tell you about next month's meeting. The subject will be memories of the Warsaw Ghetto. But I think what is clear in the book is that it's not about Israel, and it's not about the Hampstead Historical Society. It's really about Adam, who can't live with his Judaism or without it. He has these conversations with his non-Jewish wife, who tries to tell him just to let it go. And he says he can't. It's like a birthmark. It's with him forever, and something that he's struggling with. And that sort of tension, the notion of our Jewish identity as a birthmark that we can't live with or without, and the need to rebel against it, is the theme of a remarkable book, Howard Jacobson's The Finkler Question, which really is about somebody who feels the need to rebel, who needs to be critical of Israel for reasons that we'll come to. But before we do look at it, I think it is worth just taking a moment to think about Howard Jacobson's own journey in relation to Israel. Because actually, a couple of decades before he wrote this book, which is very much about Israel or British Jewish attitudes to Israel, he wrote another book, which was a personal journey book, which was called Roots Schmoots, which described his own journey to find out, find his family roots. And in that book, he does a deal with his wife of the time, who is an Australian Catholic, that she will get to enjoy the sun in Eilat and midnight mass in Bethlehem, and he will get to find out what it is like for a Jew to return to the promised land with a prohibition on his arm. And he's not really looking to find out about Israel. It becomes clear in the book he's really looking for an argument. And he actually finds several of them. So for example, he finds himself at an evening of the Orthodox Union in Jerusalem, where there is a discussion being had, a very, very funny account, just to give a flavor of it. It's mostly American or Lim American immigrants, but one of the participants is an Israeli. Here he describes her. She is pale-faced, olive pale. She wears spectacles. I don't mean she is in spectacles, I mean she wears them. All artificially has been scoured off her skin, but there is such a vanity of austerity about her, you cannot believe the effect has been achieved without artificial means. It takes makeup to unmake you to this degree. She is not American, she is Israeli. She doesn't press this advantage overtly, but she lets the fact of it play like music through her words. When she speaks, you hear it. Also, when she speaks, she rolls a sweet between her fingers. Anyway, at some point in the discussion, Howard Jacobson loses it. They're talking about who should be thrown out of the country, whether it should be Arabs, whether it should be non-religious Jews, and so on. And he stands up and starts shouting at them. He says, something snaps in my soul, and at last I break all my working rules, a felony for which the punishment is suffocation by snood, and cause silence and consternation to fall on the room by announcing myself as a non-Torah Jew from England. I know who I am now, who has turned up tonight to hear what fine examples might be set him by Torah Jews, and has found here in Israel, irony of ironies, nothing but blasphemy and sacrilege. But his evening is only just beginning. And later on in the evening, he meets another couple, this time not a Jewish couple, a non-Jewish couple, a Christian couple from Tunbridge Wells, who have decided that before they have children, they want to spend time volunteering to help with the Palestinians. And if anything, they rub him the wrong way even more than the Jews do. He describes them. They pack me around with baby talk. It's like having my tummy tickled. They can't get over the warmth and friendliness of the Palestinian people. Traveling on a bus with them is just, well, lovely. Their eyes meet in a love tryst. They're getting off on the Palestinian people. It's a sort of extended honeymoon that they're on. And it has gone cold in the vicinity of my heart. We are past dealing with rights or wrongs, truths or untruths. I smell the enemies of my soul. Forget the Palestinians. With them, we are just having a family quarrel. The enemies of my soul come from Tunbridge Wells. For a couple of mad minutes, thanks to Philip, I regret having fought with my people over the Torah. This is the effect that the enemies of your soul can have on you. So an enormous amount of pent-up anger, and I suppose one of the things that's so interesting about the book is that Israel is not a major part of it for Howard Jacobson. It's sort of a little side trip that he does as an afterthought, and his main journey to his roots is actually in Lithuania. But I think all of this ambivalence makes the book, the Finkler question, all the more remarkable. Finkler is not, like Jacobson was, looking for an argument. He is, like some of other Jacobson's characters, sort of consumed by neuroses and envy and so on. And he is looking for fame and affirmation. And he actually gets it on desert island discs. And so here is Finkler being interviewed on desert island discs. He goes, for his book, he picked the dialogues of Plato, but also wondered if they would bend the rules this once and let him take along the complete Harry Potter as well. As light relief from all that seriousness, the presenter asked. No, that's the Plato, Finkler said, joking, of course, but also meaning it for those who wanted him to mean it. Then, to prove to his wife, his non-Jewish wife, that she was not the only Jew in their marriage, he made much of going to the synagogue every morning with his father and listening to him saying prayers for his parents, great searing lamentations that moved and yes, marked him deeply. You could hear, he thought, a pin drop in the studio. His Jewishness had always been immeasurably important to him, he confided, a matter of daily solace and inspiration. But he couldn't stay silent about the dispossession of the Palestinians. In the matter of Palestine, he went on, with a falter in his voice, I am profoundly ashamed. Now, his wife, his non-Jewish wife, who he calls the Jew in their marriage, is furious with him. She says, profoundly ashamed, profoundly self-important, you mean? She said when she heard the program, how could you? How couldn't I? Because that wasn't what the program was about. That's how you couldn't, because no one was asking. I know your conscience made you a convenient entity, your conscience. There when you need it, not when you know, well, not when you don't. Anyway, his wife may not be impressed with him, but there is an organization of Jews who are called ASH, short for Ashamed Jews, who hear the interview and decide to make him their spokesman. And he becomes the leading voice for Jews who are proud to be ashamed to be Jewish. And he really becomes intoxicated by this world of political correctness. And it's a world that he lampoons brilliantly, but one of the, to my mind, most interesting descriptions of it comes from a non-Jewish writer, a first-rate non-Jewish novelist, Ian McEwan. He wrote a book called Solar. Solar tells the story, a novel, of Michael Beard, who is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who gets into hot water when he suggests in a lecture that there is scientific evidence that there may be cognitive differences between men and women. And when he says something like this, he falls foul of political correctness. He is hauled up before the Senate, and he's about to actually lose his tenure or be thrown out of the university. And in this meeting at the Senate, the case against him is going to be made by a leading feminist academic, Nancy Temple. It looks like nothing could possibly save him. And then something does. And this is the description of what happens in the Senate. It turns out that Nancy Temple, the feminist academic, is unable to come. Nancy Temple's replacement was Susan Applebaum, a visiting academic from Tel Aviv, who lectured in cognitive psychology and was as light as a bird in her red and blue frock with a twittering voice to match. She was nervous speaking in public and made an awkward start. In the theater, there was suspicion and some confusion. From the point of view of the audience, which seemed to be of one mind in all things, she had points in her favor and points against. It was clear that she was speaking against Beard. On the other hand, she was a Jew, an Israeli, and by association, an oppressor of Palestinians. Perhaps she was a Zionist. Perhaps she had served in the army. And once she got underway, the hostility in the room began to grow. This was a postmodern crowd with well-developed antennae for the unacceptable line. Its heart, when not seized by correct utterance from correct quarters, turned cold. So at the end, the anti-Zionist political correctness trumps the anti-feminist political correctness. And at least in this case, Michael Beard is able to stay on in his university. This is the milieu in which Finkler is attracting a tremendous amount of attention and fame, the fame that he was looking for, until finally the dissonance of what he is doing causes him to crack. And there is a scene that maybe I'll just touch on briefly, where he and another leading figure from ASH, Tamara Kraus, are in a public debate against the British community Jews who are trying to defend Israel. And I have to say, having spent obviously a fair amount of my time in these milieux, it is entertaining for me to see the critique of the defense of Israel. So here is Finkler looking at the community Jews trying to defend Israel. Naomi Kraus has made her case, and then the community Jews were no match for her, which wasn't saying much. Had they been the only speakers, they'd still have contrived to lose the debate. They confounded themselves. Finkler sighed as they went through routines that had been tired when he first found them from when he first heard them from his father 30 or more years before. How tiny Israel was. How long-standing were Jewish claims to the land? How few of the Palestinians were truly indigenous? How Israel had offered the world but every effort at peacemaking and been rebuffed by the Arabs? How much more necessary than ever a secure Israel was in a world in which anti-Semitism was on the increase? Why didn't they hire him to write their scripts? He could have won it for them. You win by understanding something of what the other side thinks. They understood nothing. And in the end, it's paradoxically the weakness of their arguments that really kicks into him. And he stands up in the middle of the debate, turns into his own side and says, how dare you? And if you want to read the argument that he makes against the ashamed Jews, you can see it in the Finkler question on page 235. So I want to start trying to draw to a close, and I haven't been following them all, but I know everybody has their favorite pieces of English literature that relate to Israel, and I apologize for having left out so many wonderful ones. And maybe Tadeusz, it would be wonderful to collect references that people have thrown out in the chat and maybe share them in some way, because we won't have a chance to discuss them all. But I do want to make a couple of points in conclusion and leave some time for discussion. So I think one of the points, and we've touched on it already, is how much of this writing doesn't really relate to the reality of Israel, but relates to Israel as a sort of concept on which we project our own identities. And this is a point that was actually made by Howard Jacobson in an essay that he wrote around the time of the publication of the Finkler question. He wrote, "For the purposes of my narrative, Israel exists only poetically in the imaginations of those who cannot adequately describe themselves without it. I happen to think this is largely true outside my novel as well, that Israel performs a function greater than itself, enabling or disabling ideas about belonging and disengagement, fanning the flames of ancient allegiances and animosities. For many Jews and non-Jews in this country, Israel has become a figure of speech, the occasion for wild and whirling words, a pretext for bottling up or setting loose emotions which originate somewhere else entirely." Maybe a little bit like the shtetl, which for so many people has become a sort of historic fantasy or projection, somewhat distant from actually was there. We now have Israel, which is this screen, and while the contours of the screen have some impact, so much of what is described, the colors and the shape, are actually a projection from the identity of the writers. And yet, if I had to try and identify what seems to be happening in more recent years, I think increasingly there is an engagement with the reality, the muddy complexity of Israel. And I see it in all sorts of places. One of the things that was very striking to me when we spent time in England, was how many prominently Jewish newspaper columnists there are, for whom actually being Jewish is part of their calling card and their public identity. And once in a while, these people would write about Israel. And when they did, you felt the pain, you felt the complexity and the entanglement of the reality. Just a couple of examples. Here, for example, Hugo Rifkin, a wonderful columnist in the Times. He writes, "All Jews are not Israel, and indeed Israel is not all Jews. In fact, if you've met Israelis and you've met British Jews, you may have noticed that they don't even have much in common. David Ben-Gurion, the first Israeli prime minister, once declared that Zionism would only be complete once they were Jewish policemen arresting Jewish prostitutes and Jewish thieves and throwing them in Jewish jails. And I must confess that in North London, that's just not the way that things are going. It's a rare Jew that can honestly maintain that his or her Judaism is wholly incidental to his or her views in Israel. And my own response, I've noticed, takes the form of hypersensitivity. And there's a lot to be hypersensitive about. It's like fighting my way through a thicket. Does Israel have a right to defend itself from rocket attacks? Tick. Does Israel have the right to assassinate Hamas leadership and then complain there's nobody to negotiate with? Maybe not so much. Another columnist from a paper at the other end of the spectrum, The Guardian, Jonathan Friedland, he talks about the weariness of engaging with Israel. He says, through all of it is the weariness of those living and dying in the conflict, most of all, but also those drawn into it somehow. And I feel it myself, a deep fatigue with the struggle, with the actions of both sides, and sometimes especially with their cheerleaders abroad. And maybe just one last example of this complexity of the reality. Here is Giles Corran, another very funny Jewish columnist, who was asked to sum up what it means to be Jewish in 50 words. This is what he came up with. Nothing is ever simple. It means always buying an extra round so that nobody will call you mean. Endlessly hoping that Israel will do the right thing so you won't have to defend it at dinner parties, and praying for girls so you don't have to talk about circumcision. What an extraordinary summary of what it means to be Jewish. But if we think about the Israel aspect, nothing is ever simple. Hugo Rifkin trapped in a thicket. Jonathan Friedland exhausted with this fatigue, the exhaustion of caring. Giles Corrin's fear of being embarrassed by Israel at the pub. And I think it's many things, but in part it is the turbulence of re-entry into history, into a world of reality, not the utopias of George Eliot or John Buchan or fantasies of kibbutz life, but a sort of complex relationship with a distant entity that still makes claims on us. And I saw that there was a question that just came up while we were talking about contemporary novelists. And one of the things, I'll be honest, I know less British novelists recently who have engaged with this, but I think, and it's a separate subject, you do see it in the young Jewish American writers. If you think about Jonathan Safran Foer and Nicole Krauss and Nathan Englander and Joshua Cohen and others, they have a very different relationship with Israel from the generation that came before them, the Saul Bellows and the Philip Roths and so on. On the one hand, they're a little bit more distant. If that earlier generation talked about first cousins in Israel, often in their novels, it would be second cousins. But on the other hand, in most other ways, they are much closer. They speak Hebrew, they've spent time in Israel, and they are engaging with the complexity. But I do think there's signs of this in English literature as well. And just to leave you with a sense of that complex, nuanced, very poignant relationship, I want to go back, if I can, to Linda Grant. Linda Grant, the novelist who wrote this book, The People on the Street, about her relationship with Israel. And I think she captures that spirit, as I say, very poignantly at the end of the book. She ends her book on the beach at Jaffa. And here's what she says. I saw my parents there, walking arm in arm along the beachfront lights. I saw us all. I knew I was among people who are not so pleasant and whom suffering has not improved. To love them is no easy thing. And so I thought that this is where I belonged, as a person who has come to understand that love is not a sentimental matter. Love is pain and loss. It must end in grief and mourning because we will close our eyes one day and our beloved will vanish for all eternity. But only here does life for me exist in all of its dimensions, a human tragedy with all its comic elements, and still it does. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was a real panorama of the different versions of Israel that have been depicted in so many ways. And there's lots of comments and lots of different ideas that you've raised. I do feel like I need to refer to some of the comments that we have. That period in the 70s, I actually I remember going to the British Film Festival and seeing Bob Hoskins throwing his arm around his kibbutz mother who had come to see him, because he also was one of the volunteers you mentioned. I'm wondering why in 1965, as Shirley says, volunteers were forbidden to play Beatles music in their quarters in the evening. I was sure that that would have been they would have been much loved also in Israel. There's also when we're talking about the utopia of kibbutz, Wendy has mentioned the Lynn Reed Banks book about how she felt when she wasn't able to see her child, other when she was given her allotted times at the baby's house, which is a huge feature of what people recall about kibbutz. Do you want to refer to those, and then we can? There's a question which is bringing us right up to date, which is about Ukraine.
Sure. So first of all, just to echo your point opening, it was striking to me in the years that I was in England what a deep experience kibbutz had been for so many people who are now in fairly significant places in British life. It had been, I don't know if it's an exact analogy, but if you meet young Jews from America, camp has been such a critical moment in there. And I think this in some ways even more so because it had this ideological element. It really plugged in to that notion that we are a new generation, we're fighting against the materialism of our predecessors. And I don't think it was the norm, Beatles music, but it's absolutely true that in Israel at the time, David Ben-Gurion actually was opposed to the Beatles and actually prohibited them coming to visit Israel because the feeling was they were going to corrupt the youth. And my predecessor as ambassador in England, Ron Prosser, worked very hard to get Paul McCartney to visit Israel as a sort of reparation, you know, a correction for that historic thing. But it's also a sign, but the fact is we haven't addressed Israeli literature, but the way in which those tensions, the new and the old, combined in terms of the kibbutz, I think was very true indeed. I have to say, in this brief talk, there were a number of authors that I really did want to mention that I wasn't able to. Lynn Reed Banks would have to be one of them, as somebody who was deeply engaged in Israel, wrote quite a lot of novels based in Israel, had a deep experience of Israeli life. At the end of the day, I just have to apologize for not doing, but I certainly, if somebody wants to take this further, I would certainly recommend.
Absolutely. There's also a question that's just come in, and I think we should maybe have put out a reading list before this session, but I think that some people would appreciate if we can send out a list of the books that you've mentioned, so we can talk about that afterwards. I mean, sure. Bringing this into the analogy between the current struggle in Ukraine and the issue of how Ukrainians are portrayed in Russian literature under Dostoevsky, under the Tsars, and Bulgakov under the Soviets. I'm quoting here Anna, who's written and actually asked a question. She says, but Jews, Irish, and other ethnicities of England got lucky. Your former empire moved forward to the light of democracy, inclusivity, non-colonialism. Some people might debate that. And at the same time, the Russian Empire inherited by Putin land has gone backwards. So there's an issue about literature and in which context it goes into the future and where it's forgotten in the dustbins of history. And then the question is, you know, as she's described, is there an analogy between Israeli and Ukrainian survival vector? I mean, this is asking you, I suppose, to put on your diplomat hat, and the deep similarities despite the distinct specifics. You know, is in terms of the way this is panned out in literature, it's that would require another 3 lectures, I would think. But do you feel there's any parallels here?
So first of all, I think if we're talking about those issues through a literary prism, and I don't want to address the politics of them, these things obviously take time. They obviously take, you know, there's a lag as these things filter through into literary expression. But one of the things that was interesting to me, actually, when I was recently in the UK, is that I don't want to overstate it, and this is somewhat anecdotal, but I was surprised how what was happening in the Ukraine was causing a number of people at the progressive end of the spectrum to rethink some of their assumptions about Israel. And in a sense, it was almost moving them historically back, because as they looked what was happening, and again, I'm not talking here about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, but what they were seeing was 2 Jewish communities, significant Jewish communities in the Ukraine and in Russia, which 75 years ago plus would have had nowhere to turn. And here was Israel that had officials on the borders that were providing passports and refuge and so on. And not only that, you had Israel there, which is at the border, being one of the most significant aid players, not for the Jewish communities, but more broadly for refugees from the conflict. And in a small way, I think it helped people reconnect with the excitement of Israel as having a historic mission, rather than this younger generation that simply takes it as a almost unnecessary fact of life that we can afford to use as a sword in our rebellion against our parents and so on. So I don't want to overstate that, but there was something that I did notice in some quarters.
That's really interesting. And as you say, this is something that's still panning out. And I do just want to mention that at the National Library of Israel, we've been running activities for Ukrainian and Russian refugees that have had to come here because of the situation that they've been in, and finding themselves very disorientated. And we had a fantastic theatrical performance where they were able to express, and we will be capturing and documenting that. And that's sort of another chapter in this whole story. I'm just trying to look through here to some of the other questions. Yes, please send a list of books. We've had 2 of those, and I don't know, Tadesh, is there anyone with their hand raised who wants to say something? Because I can't see that.
Not yet, but this is what I would like to ask, because I think there were some issues with the chat. So if any one of you would like to ask a question via mic, please raise your hand and I will unmute you. There are some people before, but
we have another message coming in here. Can there be a list of children's books published in the UK about Israel? Well, we can certainly see if we usually order any book that is published about Israel or about anything Jewish. So we can certainly try and find that information for you, Sandy. I'm just looking here about this. If anybody hasn't raised their hands, then there was a question that takes us right back to the beginning of your talk about Daniel Deronda and the use of music, an article written about the use of music, in which all the Jews in the novel are musical. And there's a character named Klezmer, and all the Christians are not musical. I mean, that's a sort of, it's a theme that unifies the novel.
So first of all, I had never thought of that. I mean, I'd noticed obviously that the character was called Klezmer, but I do think it's, the book is something of a polemic, and that's part of the polemicism of it. That George Eliot hears a historic music in the Jewish story that she doesn't identify, and again, you could see the same sort of thing in the appeal of kibbutz. There is some strain of idealism that we are missing in our own society that's very, very appealing. But I hadn't thought of it being given sort of symbolic expression through music. I'm sure that's true, and I hadn't thought of it before.
Thank you. I think Stephen Muzzle has just raised his hand. Tadesh, can you unmute him?
Yes, please. Wait a second. I don't see him. I'm sorry. Who's
panelist? Maybe Stephen, you want to write in the chat your question? I don't know if he is a panelist, because people are managing to write in the chat.
I see there is Nicole. Okay, I will unmute Nicole now. Nicole, please, you can speak. Yes,
thank you. I found it a very interesting talk. Thank you so much. But I tried to write down the names of the authors you mentioned, but sometimes it went too fast.
I promise I will send Karen and Tadeusz a list of all of the books, and maybe I'll even add in 1 or 2 that I would have liked to speak about that I wasn't able to get to, and really would heartily recommend them.
Okay, thank you so much. That was all.
Right.
I don't have so many questions, in fact.
I'm just trying to...
Thank you. Yes, Stephen, please.
Stephen Muzzle and Hilda Sandrick-Lewin.
Please, you can ask.
Can you hear me?
Here we are, Stephen.
Do you hear me?
Yes, faintly, but we hear you. But you're unmuted. You're okay, now speak.
Well, I had a question, but the discussion about music in Daniel Deronda, the particular point about klezmer, that Gwendolyn doesn't practice, whereas the other people do practice.
Are you a musician yourself, Stephen? Are you a music teacher, perhaps?
No, I'm not. I'm just reading closely. Now, the point I had written down concerns where you start with Daniel Deronda, but you should actually start with Milton. in English literature. The sense in Paradise Lost of the ancient splendors of the land, or in the first 10 lines of Paradise Lost, or if Sion Hill delight thee more, and Siloa's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God. Milton brings Israel into England.
So, Stephen, that's such an interesting point. The fact is, if you go back before the 19th century, you will find, you know, extraordinary descriptions. And William Blake builds Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land in the same sort of spirit. You have sort of hints in Shakespeare, Richard II, John of Gaunt, and this demi-paradise that is England and so on. And that would be a fascinating study. But for our purposes, I was trying to connect English literature with the move of the Jewish people to reestablish their homeland in this historic plot. And I may have missed it, but I didn't see that in Milton. I mean, Milton has a tremendous historic spiritual feeling for Israel, but the notion of a new, renewed Jewish entity there, I think, is something that we probably need to wait until the 19th century.
No, it's in Milton's time, it relates also to Manasseh ben Israel and Cromwell, that the Jews should be everywhere.
That's true.
The conversion of everybody. And in Balfour's case, get the Jews settled in Israel, in Palestine, and you again set the scene for the conversion, which we don't want anyway.
Stephen, thank you for your
Stephen.
question. We had one other person that I could see was Hilda, who had her hand raised, and then I think we're going to have to draw the questions to a close.
Yes,
Hilda,
I unmute you, please speak.
Hi, hello. First of all, I was so impressed with this talk. It was very, very intensive. I just want to ask, please, if you don't mind, when you send the list, because the recording stopped for a short while, in which time you mentioned a list of anti-Zionist writers. One of them was G.K. Chesterton. If you don't mind including that in the list.
I feel a little bit bad about mentioning them. Possibly I shouldn't even have mentioned them in the talk. I mentioned in the context of John Buchan that if you grow up in a British society, there are a number of writers who you associate with being anti-Semitic, largely because one of two lines, or sometimes because one of two lines in things that they wrote. Personally, I don't think it's critical to the argument that I was making, and I don't want to badmouth people more than I need to, if that's okay. But I will make sure I send out the list of all of the books.
And I must, may I just add something? Having worked in 1960 on two kibbutzim, I was quite amused by the one author who said, gee, the Jews are they are such geniuses. They get us to fly there at our own expense and to work on the kibbutz for nothing. I thought it was quite amusing, actually.
There's Mark, there's quite a few hands up here, and I am conscious of time. Tadeusz, there's somebody called Mark you mentioned, and then there's Wendy Bloomfield here as well. So I think those will be the last two.
Yes, Mark, please speak. You are unmuted now.
Thank you very much. Wonderful talk. Just on a sort of adjunct point, I wonder whether maybe for a future occasion we might do a little similar talk on sort of genre of British Olim who have contributed magnificently to the cause of Israel generally, but also literature. I'm thinking in particular, you know, your eminent forebear Daniel Yehuda Avner, Ephraim Halevi, and various others who have really provided tremendous insights into their lives in the diplomatic corps and just general sort of Israeli public life. And I thought managed to bring its life in a very entertaining and sparkling way. In particular, Yehuda Avner's account, which I think is really unsurpassed, of his special kosher friendly meal at the White House, is an absolute classic. So perhaps on another occasion you might regale us with that, and perhaps add your own particular brand of novel or non-fictional account to the genre.
So first of all, I think it's a lovely idea. I'm not sure I'm the person to do it, but if anybody does want to do it, within the Foreign Ministry, actually, there's a book collection, a special bookshelf or mini library of books that have been written by diplomats, including fiction and non-fiction and so on. And yeah, that would be a good place to start, maybe with the English language books or something based around those books and so on. Simply on the kosher food thing, I can tell you that my experience, having also had quite a number of meals that were very fancy, that the caterers sort of worked very hard to match the food that was on your plate with that everybody else was having. It never quite worked because they might have matched the food, but they didn't match the quantities. And while everybody was getting these very little sort of French cuisine, small amounts of pate, you would end up with this mountain in the middle of your plate, and everybody's looking at you and wondering why you're the favorite and so on. So it's so I can identify with that. But a nice idea.
Thank you. Wendy Bloomfield, I think you will be our last questioner if you still want to say something.
Yes, please. First of all, that was a wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to go back a little further in history. Byron, the poet, he wrote the hidden Hebrew melodies. And there are references to proto-Zionism in there, and they're beautiful, and they were put to music.
I think that's absolutely right. There's an extraordinary couplet where he describes, I forget, I wish I could quote it for you, but the Jewish people being tossed around this sort of valiant Hebrew band and so on. And you're absolutely right. You know, I wasn't thinking about poetry, but if we broaden English literature a little bit, that should definitely be there. And thank you very much for reminding us.
Thank you. I think, and Tadeusz, you're in charge now of who else is allowed to speak, because you've been sending me a text asking for a few more minutes, if that's all right with you, Daniel. Is there anything else?
We have 4 more minutes for the, so we can take the last question from Shirley. Shirley, I will unmute.
Frank. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. You hear me? Yes.
Yes.
I just wanted to point out quickly that Daniel Deronda was not the only weak male characterization in George Eliot's novels. In fact, I wrote my whole dissertation on this, but the rest of it isn't about any Jewish themes. But she had a whole series of men like Ladislaw in Middlemarch and Stephen in The Mill and the Floss, who were very poorly constructed, as opposed to these women like Maggie, like Dorothea, and like Gwendolyn, who were very well portrayed. And I attribute that to her attributing to men a kind of a, well, women to women, an artistic desire that could not be fulfilled, even though she herself fulfilled her own artistic desires. But in those days, women just couldn't become artists. So she gave the artist type characterization to men, and it doesn't come off very well. So I just thought I'd mention that, because it actually was a whole thesis showing this. It was called The Artist and the Woman in George Eliot's novels. So I just wanted to show that Daniel Deronda kind of fits into a pattern, it being her last novel.
Thank you for that, Shirley. And Daniel, I don't know if you want to sum up with any final remarks, because we will certainly save the chat and then send it to you so you can see some of the comments at your leisure.
So I first of all, I don't have anything particular to add. Thank you so much for the questions, which were rich and inciting. And I don't know if there's a way to do this. I'm sure that a lot of the people who are listening have other examples of Israel that have surfaced in different parts of English literature. And if somebody is able to share them, add them onto the list, that would be wonderful. So this is sort of like a growing body of sort of corpus of shared knowledge.
That would be wonderful. Yes. We will see how we can manage that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. This has been really a fascinating subject, which definitely needs to be continued. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Thank you so much and have a very good evening. All the best.